And we've reached the final bonus episode of You're All Doomed, the podcast that has made its way through Freddy vs. Jason 13 minutes at a time. I'm Greg.
And I'm your favorite dream demon, Brian.
And the garbage time of this movie begins with the last of the credits. The movie ends, of course, with the New Line Cinemas logo and the MPAA's rating, and then fades to black. So we'll cover those last few details before launching into our larger topics. As we discuss the credits, we should point out that this movie was produced by Sean S. Cunningham, who originated the Friday the 13th series to begin with, and so it's nice that he's maintained a hands-on approach. Some of the other credits that jumped out at me are people with quotation mark nicknames. One of the first assistant accountants was Tim Biff Turner, and one of the drivers was Paul Spike Irvine. As far as credited characters go, Jason's mother, Pamela, in this movie was played by Paula Shaw, who appeared in that weird-ass Christopher Walken alien movie Communion, the John Frankenheimer Ben Affleck vehicle Reindeer Games. She also played a coroner in Christopher Nolan's Insomnia, and was Grandma Demon on Supernatural. But most importantly, she played a character named Charlene in Savage Streets, which was directed by Danny Steinman, who directed Part 5, A New Beginning. Mark's brother Bobby was played by Zach Ward. He's a writer, producer, and director who is probably most well known as Scott Farkas in The Christmas Story, as Brian mentioned. He played that character alongside the little dude that played young Michael Anthony in the Hot for Teacher Van Halen video. Zach Ward also appeared in Friday the 13th, the series, marking his ascent as one of the few people who has been in both versions of this franchise. Some of his other big-budget appearances were in Cameron Crowe's Almost Famous and the Michael Bay Transformers series. It seems like he's moved on to other endeavors, which is great, and we're always happy to see him pop up. Apparently, he also follows us on Twitter, which is awesome. So if he's listening to this, hey, man, what's up?
And Greg, I'm going to point this out mostly for your benefit, but Zach Ward was also born on the exact same day as Debbie Gibson.
Wake me up before you go. I don't know any Debbie.
That's Wham! Electric Youth. Come on.
I thought that was a band that was on The Simpsons. Oh, wait, no, that's Sonic Youth. Brian, you're the music guy. I don't know shit.
I can't stand talking music with you. I'm surprised you even knew Beyonce. Although you did admit you had to look up a YouTube video to know how to pronounce her name correctly. So.
Well, just the Queen Bey. Sheriff Williams was played by Gary Chalk, who has over 400 credits, and so I did not scroll through every single one. However, some noteworthy things that jumped out at me were an appearance in The Journey of Natty Gann with Meredith Salinger, who actually appeared in this week's issue of the X-Men comic book. He also appeared in The Fly 2, Danger Bay, which we've discussed at length, was the voice of Optimus Primal on Transformers Beast Wars, and a voice of a character in Warriors of Virtue, the Ronnie Yu movie we mentioned earlier. He also did a voice of a character in a cartoon series called Mummies Alive, which my friend Eric and I laugh about every time it comes up, because the theme song is basically, the hero fights the bad guys as a mummy and does other stuff as a mummy. It's really, really stupid. He played Dum Dum Dugan in the David Hasselhoff Nick Fury TV movie. And since this movie, played a bartender on Season 2 of Fargo, which is one of my favorite movies, and played a postal worker in the Shane Black-directed The Predator. Laurie's dad was played by Tom Butler, who has a bunch of TV cameos, kind of the usual credits for this series with X-Files and 21 Jump Street, anything that was filmed in Vancouver. He also appeared in Josie and the Pussycats, Snakes on a Plane, 50 Shades of Grey, and more recently, Sonic the Hedgehog. Will was played by Jason Ritter, the son of comedy actor John, who died almost exactly a month after this movie was released. That means that Jason Ritter's stepmom is Amy Yazbek, who grew up in Blue Ash, which is just about 2 miles down the road from where I live. He also played Bar Guy Number 2 in the hilarious Nicolas Cage remake of The Wicker Man, and was a voice in Frozen 2, the cartoon, not the Wolf movie that Kane Hodder was the stunt coordinator for. He also has had recurring roles on the Parenthood TV series and the comedy series Another Period.
I also see him pop up a lot on Drunk History, playing various characters. I was also surprised to see that he's married to Melanie Lynskey, who is really awesome. She played the non-Kate Winslet role in Heavenly Creatures, but also most recently she was in a really good HBO show called Togetherness. Laurie
was played by Monica Keena, who had an early acting credit in The Devil's Advocate. We knew her best from Dawson's Creek. I did not remember that she died at the end of the second season.
I didn't either. I just remembered when I saw her character name, I was like, oh yeah, I remember she was like the queen bitch of Cape Side High on the show. But then I was also really surprised to see that not only did she die, but apparently all the like main characters on the show, like the characters, not the actors, but the characters weren't overly concerned by the fact that she died. They were just kind of like, oh, well, this is kind of a relief that Abby's gone because she was a real bitch. So yeah, I think she just played a hated character the entire time.
Nice. I haven't watched that since it was originally broadcast, but I see it's streaming on Netflix, so I might go back and revisit the early seasons of that series because it was hilarious.
I've wanted to do the same, but I'm just going to warn you that they don't have the original music in it, including the original theme song. They have a different song, and it's more jarring than you would expect. If you're a fan of the TV show and it starts up and you don't hear the Paula Cole song, it immediately kind of pulls you out of the moment. So
it's just going to throw you off a lot, huh? Yeah. Interesting.
So for that reason, I've actually been reluctant to dive back into it because I'm like, there's no Paula Cole, then it's just not Dawson's Creek.
Monica Keena also appeared in Undeclared, which was the follow-up series by the guys that did Freaks and Geeks, which is my all-time favorite TV show. She's a longtime romantic partner with Edward Furlong. It looks like they've struggled over the years with some substance and domestic abuse issues, but they are still together and attend fan conventions. And, she's still around and still acting. And appeared on the Crystal Lake Memories documentary, and she seems like a very bright woman, and I bet she'd be fun to talk to. Interestingly, nobody who played Jason was credited kind of in the main end title sequence, but they do appear in the crawl. Little Jason was played by an actor named Spencer Stump, who doesn't seem to have a whole lot of other credits, but did a good job wearing sweatpants. Adult Jason was played by Ken Kersinger, who is the second build in the credit crawl. He's mainly a stunt guy, but does have small acting roles as the arguing evacuee in The Day the Earth Stood Still. And he doubled for Kane Hodder in Friday the 13th Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, in a scene where Jason is hit by a car. He's also flung into the mirror of the diner that we talked about in that season of the show. And the big star of this film is obviously Freddy Krueger, who was played by Robert Englund. I mean, talk about a guy with a million credits. Robert Englund has been around since the 70s. He acted in a ton of TV shows. The ones that stood out to me were V, where he played the friendly lizard visitor, Manimal with Simon McCorkindale. Movie-wise, Robert Englund appeared in the Roger Corman classic Galaxy of Terror, but Freddy was really the role that put him on the map, and he is, rightly made a career out of being Freddy, talking about Freddy. That is his signature role and what he will be most remembered for.
He played Freddy in an episode of the ABC show The Goldbergs, and his name was Mr. Knifey Hands. Which seems like something that Kia would have called him.
No, she would have just had something much more offensive.
He also directed 976 Evil, which came out in 1988. And what was interesting about that was that it was co-written by Brian Hegeland, who went on to write the Oscar-winning screenplay for L.A. Confidential.
He directed that movie?
Yeah.
No shit.
But what really jumped out to me was that he was considered for the role of Mr. Joshua in Lethal Weapon.
The big pause here in the podcast is because Brian has just destroyed my mind with this fact. That would have been fascinating. I mean, I love Gary Busey as Mr. Joshua, but holy shit, that's crazy.
Yeah, I did spend some time kind of trying to imagine him in some of those scenes. I think Busey's great in that role, and he's, you know, suitably very like crazy and unstable, but there's no reason why Englund couldn't have pulled it off himself. But the first thing I jumped to was like imagining Mel Gibson and Robert Englund fighting in the front yard, you know, with the broken fire hydrant. But yeah, I think he would have done a pretty good job.
Closing out the credits, I noticed that the famous is credited as Friday the 13th Jason vocal effects, written by Harry Manfredini and performed by Stephen Dewey for Machine Head.
So when I was done with the research for this movie, I started to think about, you know, our history with Jason Voorhees in particular, but also, you know, from an outside perspective, Freddy Krueger. And, you know, we had heard, you know, rumors or, you know, had been threatened with movies or ideas involving Freddy and Jason for a while. And then this finally came to fruition. And I still can't decide if what we got is what I wanted. I've been trying to think of a better idea than what we ended up seeing on the screen. The idea of Freddy losing his power because people are no longer afraid of him, and then therefore he has to recruit Jason to get people scared again so that they start having nightmares, is like, I guess on the surface, it's a totally fine idea, but there's just no way that you can make it interesting once you start digging into it. And I think the movie itself even kind of figured that out as it was going along, because it just kept reminding us what the rules were, but it never really advanced the story at all. It was just telling us what the rules were. And then, you know, 10, 15 minutes would go by and they would remind us what the rules were again, but nothing was really changing. There was no twist or flaw to the plan other than the stupid conceit of Jason being afraid of water. But even that didn't last long at all. I mean, it was such a tiny part of the movie. But no matter how hard I try, I just can't think of a better idea. And I'm not saying that what we got is a good idea. I'm just saying that I feel like overall the idea of Freddy versus Jason is best left to being something that's blurted out to your friends at a bar one night. You know, like you're drinking beers and you're like, oh man, you know, it would be awesome. A Freddy versus Jason movie. And all your buddies are like, yeah, that would kick ass. And then just leave it at that. Like, don't go into it. Don't try to figure out like how you're going to execute it or what that actually means. Because once you start doing that, it just dilutes the whole concept to the point where you get kind of like what this movie is, where, you know, they took it one step further. They're like, yeah, and Freddy is losing his power. And so he recruits Jason and his friends are like, yeah, that's cool. And then what? I don't know. Like, we'll just remind people that that's what we're doing. And then at the end, there'll be this big fight. And that's what everyone wants to see, right? And that's really, I remember that's how I felt leaving the movie the first time, which was like, well, at least we got that pretty cool fight at the end.
Well, just like Freddy and Jason have a beef, you and I are going to disagree because I love this movie. No, I'm just kidding. I'm right there with you. You know, hearkening all the way back to when we saw Freddy's glove burst out of the dirt and drag Jason's mask below the ground, and Jason goes to hell. I've been thinking, like, what would a perfect Freddy versus Jason movie be? And I think the answer is it would be 10 minutes long and on funnyordie.com. You know, what do you really want from a Freddy versus Jason movie if you stop and think about it? It's a 10 or 15 minute fight scene like we got, where there's a ton of blood, it's super gory, couple other people get killed, but there's not a lot to it. There's not a lot interesting that you can do with it because they are so dissimilar in their approach to killing people. So it's not like two magical beings who fight or two physical beings who fight. Depending on what realm they're in, one has an obvious upper hand on the other. Unless you blur the lines, which I think they did, because the amount of punishment that physical Freddy took in the real world was absolutely ridiculous. I never got the sense that he was particularly strong in the real world. I mean, Nancy was able to kick his ass with a sledgehammer and some exploding light bulbs, for God's sake, unless that whole movie was a dream. But, I mean, what we wound up getting is a mediocre movie. It's not particularly terrible, and it's not particularly good. I wish it had been particularly terrible, because that would have been a lot more interesting for us to talk about this season. It's perfectly fine. It's perfunctory. I'm not intending to insult anybody who put effort into this movie. I just don't think that the concept has enough meat on its bones for anybody to bring anything particularly good to the idea. There are hundreds of ways you could go terribly wrong with the idea. But this movie is not scary. It's funny, but not funny enough, in my estimation. There were a couple of great physical, kind of punishment comedy kind of moments, like Freddy being dragged down the length of the cabin, but not enough to make it particularly memorable. Watching it for this podcast felt like a bit of a chore. Talking about it felt like a bit of a chore. I hope managed to get enough entertainment out of it to, entertain each other and the listener, but it's just not a particularly memorable movie. It's a memorable concept. And the biggest flaw with these versus movies is my biggest problem with this movie in particular. And that's that the structure of a blank versus blank movie always seems to feel the need to give the audience a side to kind of root for. And in this instance, that means you have one guy who's a child predator and one who is a vicious mass murderer. Well, let's not embrace the child predator. Let's make Freddy so aberrant and so disgusting that he's the villain of the movie. And Jason is just like a misunderstood behemoth or something. So he even has a little bit of a bond with Laurie at the end, like they have a little understanding or some shit. And it was the same problem I had with Aliens versus Predator, where they had the character team up with the Predator against the aliens because Predator is a little more humanoid and has some intelligence, whereas the xenomorphs are, this mindless insectide hive. And I don't like that. I think that the whole point of this movie should have been these two horrible, monstrous human beings killing the shit out of people. So how would they come into conflict? What would their reason for fighting be? And I mean, I think you're right. Like, the screenwriters came up with the best possible option for how to make this movie, but that doesn't mean it was particularly worthwhile. And I almost wonder if, they were forced, I think, by expectation to have Freddy and Jason physically fight each other. But I think a more interesting approach may have been to have the whole movie be Freddy monkeying with Jason, just for some reason setting his sights on Jason and messing with his mind. And so every time Jason thinks he's killing someone, he's not, or the whole thing turns out to be this fake out or something. But it felt like it felt like the easiest answer they could come up with for these two guys to encounter each other, which to me indicates that it should never have been done at all.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking of, different ways to approach it, because when you were talking about having to choose a side, I never really thought about that, because I just naturally chose a side, with Jason, because I prefer Jason Voorhees over Freddy Krueger. But there's no good side to be rooting for here. But I just went into it like, oh, I hope Jason kicks Freddy's ass. Mm-hmm. But I do like the idea that it's more Freddy and Jason fucking with each other, but then the real world experiencing the consequences of that. So the thing that popped into my head was, what if Freddy had one more kill that he had to pull off? Like there was just someone that he just couldn't stand and just like had to get rid of them.
The final child of the Elm Street mob or something.
Exactly. And then for whatever reason, Freddy couldn't do it himself. Maybe it's the same idea. He's lost his power and he can't do it. So he has to kind of not convince Jason to do it, but almost like trick him into doing it and turning it into, like you were saying, where manipulating him and convincing him to do certain things, and then certain things that he thinks he's doing aren't really happening. But just, I don't know, just some sort of manipulation that gets Jason to this, final point. And, again, this, has been in my head for about a minute, so I haven't thought the idea through, but I like the idea of Jason going about doing his thing, being controlled by this unseen force in Freddy, and then the town or where, the camp or wherever this is taking place is trying to figure out how to stop Jason. But in the background, Freddy's pulling all the strings and is always kind of like one step ahead of them. And then it's not about rooting for Freddy or Jason. Like, you don't want either of them to succeed. You're hopefully wanting the townspeople or the camp counselors or whoever it is to stop it so that neither of them succeed. Now, granted, that doesn't really turn in, like, that doesn't satisfy the Freddy versus Jason title. But, if Jason's fighting this, puppet master the entire time, then it does, turn into a conflict. And maybe at the end they do end up fighting face to face, and that's fine. But still, I think there should be more consequences at stake than just who's going to win.
I do want to pause for a moment and talk about the fact that Kane Hodder was not cast as Jason in this movie. As we've discussed in earlier seasons, I think that's a real shame, even just from a financial participation standpoint, because in terms of raw dollars, this was the most successful movie of the franchise. And I think that after the effort he put into it and the stumping that he did for this concept for 9 years while it was in development, he deserved to be a part of it. And I really don't know why. None of the interviews that I've seen on the Crystal Lake documentary or even in Kane's book have been very clear about why he was passed over. I don't think he even really knows. The closest thing we've gotten to an explanation is that the studio executives wanted to go in a different direction. But I'm not really sure what direction that was. Ken Kersinger seems perhaps like he's taller than Kane Hodder. I don't know for sure. But they may have needed a little bit more of a height difference between Robert Englund and whoever played Jason. But in terms of portrayal, I almost wonder if they wanted someone to be a little more robotic and unemotional as Jason. Kane brings a lot of personality to the role with his head turns and his breathing. He imbues Jason with some life that I don't think Ken Kersinger brought to this role. Jason was basically a blank slate until the very end of the movie when he had that little moment with Laurie. And I mean, I don't feel like he did anything that Kane couldn't have done. So I just don't understand what the rationale was there.
It is a shame, and I don't know the answer for why Kane was not involved. I remember when I watched the Kane Hodder documentary, he made it very clear that he wasn't really sure either. And I think some of the things that you mentioned had come up. They wanted just a different portrayal of Jason. They wanted someone that was a little bit taller. But I never got the sense that Jason's height in this movie made him more intimidating, more scary. It didn't add anything to the character. The one scene where they really emphasized his height, it was so comically just inaccurate. It was when he walks out of the cornfield and comes up to those two guys, and he looks like he's 4 feet taller than these guys. And that's just ridiculous. It doesn't look real at all. So there was no advantage to his height. I thought Jason was just boring as shit in this movie. Like there was just no, he was not on screen very much at all. So, that's one problem. But even when he was, there was nothing that he was doing where it's like, oh, that's really cool. Or, my favorite shot of Jason in this movie is the overhead shot where he's marching through the cornfield on fire.
And that wasn't even Ken Kersinger.
Exactly. It could have been anyone doing that. So I don't know what they saw. And this is no disrespect to Ken Kersinger, but I just don't know what they saw in Ken that they're like, yeah, this is our guy. There's like, we're looking for a really different approach to Jason in this movie, and we need someone to do that. Like if they attempted that, like we see a very different Jason in the reboot, and we can talk about that later. But like that, I understand, like you needed a different actor to pull that off. But in this one, it's like, we didn't see anything different. In fact, if anything, we took a step backwards with what we want to see from Jason. And, it would have been nice to just have Kane in there, because I know Kane has been very vocal about what Jason would do and what he would not do. And I think that would have helped this movie a little bit. And, he definitely would have stepped in and said, Jason isn't afraid of water. But there's just nothing about this performance that justifies the change in casting. And that's what's really kind of a bummer about this whole thing.
Yeah, big time. I mean, like you say, no disrespect to Ken Kersinger. He did a fine job. He did a perfectly adequate job as Jason. But I don't think Jason should have been quite as forgettable in this movie as he wound up being. It was almost like some of the earlier guys who played him who, did great work, but didn't bring as much character to Jason. And I think that in this movie, playing up against someone like Freddy Krueger, they needed a Jason with a little more life to him. I remember when this movie came out, we were, laughing about the conceit of blank versus blank, and we came up with some ideas of our own for movie franchises that could cross over. We have White Knights versus Baps, Problem Child versus The Enforcer, The Last of the Mohicans versus The Indian in the Cupboard, The Accused versus Witness, Pretty Woman versus All the President's Men.
Oh, I'd see that movie
a couple times in very short segments. Sphere versus Cube, Taxi Driver versus Passenger 57, HUD versus Chud, Pluto Nash versus Tango and Cash, and my personal favorite, Dr. Zhivago versus Dr. Mordred.
I remember, this was probably, we were probably doing that around 2003, but we were swapping those ideas back and forth over email, because this was definitely, before we both had, cell phones and were texting each other. But I think we were just passing the time from our boring jobs and would just randomly shoot a new idea over to each other. But yeah, I remember recently finding that list, and there's a lot of ideas in there.
We have a 5-page Word document that is just all these, and they veer into the ridiculous. But we got some laughs out of it.
While we're on the topic of verses, one thing that I thought was really interesting when I was doing the research for this is that the final body count for the movie is 20. 19 of those kills are Jason, and only 1 is Freddy.
Really?
Yeah, because the only person Freddy kills is Mark.
Holy shit.
And I had the same reaction because when I was watching it, I never really felt like it was that uneven. I guess it makes sense from what Freddy was trying to do. He wanted Jason to kill people to get them scared so they had nightmares again. And I guess he does kind of allude to that when they face off in the boiler room. And he's like, you're like a dog who doesn't know when to stop eating. I just wanted you to kill a few people and you just kept going and going.
Oh, yeah, right.
But at no point was I ever really aware of like, oh my God, Jason's killing so many more people than Freddy. It wasn't until the end when I saw that stat and I'm like, seriously, Freddy only killed 1 person?
Because, Freddy couldn't even kill Blake. He wasn't strong enough yet. So Jason wound up doing it.
Yep.
I'll be damned.
And we know that because Blake was like, I'm okay. So there's a ton of trivia for this movie. As I mentioned, people at Paramount had been discussing this idea as far back as 1987 until it finally found its way over to New Line. New Line would end up spending almost $7 million to develop 17 different scripts by more than a dozen screenwriters over the course of 10 years.
Jesus. Everyone
from Sean Cunningham to Ronald D. Moore from the reboot of Battlestar Galactica took a pass at the draft. Moore's version even put Jason on trial to kind of like echo what was going on with O.J. Simpson around that time, which is also an idea that you and I joked about when we were kids, which was, like probably right after Jason Goes to Manhattan. We were like, what if it was like Jason goes to court or like Jason goes to jail or something
Jason
like that.
Drives around in a white Bronco with Al Cowlings in the backseat.
Yeah. One of the earlier drafts proposed that Freddy and Jason fight because an adult Freddy had raped Jason as a kid when he was at Camp Crystal Lake.
Boo.
Yeah, again, that goes back to what you were saying with, the kids throwing Jason into the lake. It completely changes the mythology of the movie. And it's like, on the surface, it's like, oh, yeah, that'd be sweet. But then when you dig into it, you're like, no, that doesn't work at all.
Are you sure you want to be on record as saying an adult man raping a disabled child? It would be sweet.
Yeah. Oh, I totally want to see that movie.
Okay, Seventh Heaven.
There was also something about like a cult of Freddy worshipers that were going to be called Fred heads, and their whole goal was to resurrect their spiritual leader at any cost, which just sounds painful. As far as like the filming of this movie and the drafts that they went through, there was one idea where the movie began and ended in hell, which at least aligns with, the original setup for this movie, which is Freddy pulling Jason's mask down to hell. So it tracks that it would have at least started in hell.
Right. What got us here in the first place. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think what I was reading, it was just, there's no way to film hell without it looking stupid. And so they just couldn't figure out a way to create a vision of hell that was going to be worth, looking at. So they just completely scrapped that idea.
Not just like an office building with, rows of desks, no cubicles, because, the open space concept is so awesome. That doesn't sound like hell to you, Brian?
It does sound pretty hellish. There was also early discussions about a giant hand coming out of Crystal Lake and pulling both Freddy and Jason down to hell. And I've actually seen some like conceptual drawings of what that would look like. And let's just say I'm glad it didn't happen.
Did Joss Whedon steal that for Cabin in the Woods?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, because it actually, the drawings really do mimic that. That's a really interesting point. This is more of a laundry list of scrapped ideas, but one unused script had Jason driving a Subaru. That's all it says. There's no context behind it. It's just Jason driving a Subaru. Which I'm really pissed didn't happen because I'm the guy that calls out the cars in all these movies, and I would have been able to tell you what type of Subaru it was.
Well, I mean, I think that should just be the title of the next movie. Is Jason Drives a Subaru. Brought to you by Subaru.
Other scrapped ideas included the final fight between the two of them taking place in a burning shopping mall, which I would actually like to see. Freddy killing a girl by turning her into a giant lobster and flash steaming her. Jason killing a man by shoving a shotgun up his ass. And then my favorite, which is Freddy summoning Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, and John Wayne Gacy to aid him in his final fight against Jason.
Oh, come on. Would Zac Efron play Ted Bundy?
There's an alternate opening to the movie that's actually on some versions of the DVD that I really liked. It's Heather, who is the girl that we saw on the dock, and she jumps in the water, and then she hears something in the woods, and then she gets chased and eventually killed by Jason. But in this version, it starts off with her in the cabin with all the kids, and she's waiting for them to fall asleep, and they finally fall asleep, and then she decides that she's going to sneak out. But as she's starting to sneak out, one of the kids in the cabin sees her and says, hey, I'm scared. I need you to stick around until I fall asleep. Can you stick around? And she basically says, like, screw you, kid. I'm leaving. So she leaves, and then we see the same thing happen where she jumps in the lake. She hears Jason, and she goes for a run, or tries to run away from Jason. But the first place she goes to is back to her cabin, and the door is locked, and she's pounding on the door trying to get in, and Billy's in there, and she's like, let me in, and the kid just flips her off.
Nice.
And is like, tough shit. And I thought that was nice because at least there's a little bit more background to who this character even is, and then it turns the tables where it's like, well, you kind of deserve what's about to happen to you.
Yeah, I like that a lot, although it doesn't make sense in terms of this being a dream sequence. So, I mean, I would love for them to save that for a different movie, because that's a great moment. But since the whole thing is is bullshit anyway, that's kind of silly.
And I don't know if this was just a rumor that was going around at the time, but I remember hearing that they discussed having two different endings to this movie. One where Freddy wins and one where Jason wins. And depending on which screening or which theater you attended, you wouldn't know the outcome until the end. And I don't remember if we had that in the back of our mind when we went to see the movie or if that had already been disproven. But I remember that floating around, and I don't know why they never did that, because I think it's a fantastic idea of, just seeing a potentially different fight at the end of the movie and, not knowing who's going to win.
I mean, yeah, I agree and disagree. It's a great marketing gimmick. They absolutely should have done it from a financial perspective. I quite like the ending of this movie. I think that the ambiguity of whether or not this was all a dream, or, we saw Jason kind of win, but maybe Freddy won. Like, that's kind of perfect in my mind. But I do think that, having a definitive A or B ending would also have made a shit ton of sense. I'm surprised they didn't do it.
Even if it was just like a bonus feature on the DVD where you got to see like the two different outcomes. Like, I'd be fine with that. But yeah, you're right. I don't mind the ambiguous ending because it's not entirely clear if Freddy is alive, at the end of the actual movie. So yeah, it's fine. I just remember that going around at the time, and I just don't remember at what point it was disproven.
But it would have made sense too, because I mean that was right around the same time that for Attack of the Clones, any theater that showed that movie digitally had the little extra moment of seeing Anakin's robot hand at the wedding at the end. And if you saw it on a traditional projection, you didn't get that little moment. So they were already kind of doing the little targeted marketing of movie endings. So this would have been tailor-made for that kind of thing.
From a box office standpoint, Freddy vs. Jason was released on August 15th, 2003. It had a budget of $30 million, which completely shattered all of the other movies. The previous high budget was Jason X at $11 million. To put that, into a little bit more context, the original Friday the 13th had a budget of $700,000. The opening weekend total was $36.4 million, which also shattered any opening weekend for the original movies. The previous high was actually The New Blood at $8.2 million. So 36.4 is just a massive opening. U.S. gross, it ended up making a little over $80 million, and worldwide a little over $115 million, which again just destroys any of the original ones.
Although I would argue that probably adjusted for inflation, the original beats it by a very narrow margin.
That could be, yeah, because the original made almost $40 million. So I bet adjusted for inflation, that is, it's probably neck and neck.
A few other noteworthy movies that came out in 2003, Rob Zombie's House of a Thousand Corpses, Cube 2 Hypercube, which starred the hyper-cute Carrie Matchett, 28 Days Later, Jeepers Creepers 2, which was directed by a child predator, Cabin Fever, which was an early Eli Roth movie. Tommy Wiseau's masterpiece, The Room, came out in 2003. And most importantly for this franchise, the remake of The Texas Chainsaw Massacre came out, which was directed by Marcus Nispel, who we will discuss next season.
There are quite a few taglines for this movie, so bear with me. One is the slicer, the dicer, and this time they're not any nicer.
And they know Sean Spicer.
And there's some lame ones like Freddy versus Jason, place your bets, a fright to the death, winner kills all, evil will battle evil. There's a really clunky one that goes, when the son of 100 maniacs battles an unstoppable killing machine, none will survive.
Ugh.
There's the incredibly lazy tagline, A Nightmare on Elm Street meets Friday the 13th.
Very creative.
Just spelling it out for people who had no idea what this movie was about.
When the son of 1,000 maniacs meets the son of one maniac, you won't believe what happens next.
Well, I thought this was Freddie Mercury versus Jason Bateman. And then the last one, which I kind of liked, was 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, Jason's at your door.
5, 6, both of them are pricks.
7, 8, it's going to be so great. 9, 10, never pay to see one of these movies again.
Yeah, really. But we will. And we did pay to see this opening weekend. We'd kind of, by that point, established a tradition of meeting up in Indianapolis and watching movies or going to see what just came out. So we, made a point of meeting up on opening night. And I think we may have seen this the next day. I don't think we saw it on the 13th. We may have seen it on the 14th. But the thing I do remember most is that kind of kicked off our now long-standing tradition of not discussing a single thing about the movie until we have relocated to a place that has alcohol. So we had a total lockdown of conversation until we sat at the nearby pub in downtown Indianapolis. And I even remember what the waitress looked like. There was no one else there. It was quiet because it was the middle of the early afternoon. And
she was wearing a red and green sweater.
And then she crawled down my throat. It was perfect.
I'm pretty sure that rule of not discussing it until we were able to reconvene somewhere else was my idea. And I don't know what the point of it is. I think it's more just like ensuring that we're able to just focus and sit down and get all of our thoughts out at once rather than just trickling out like, oh, I didn't like this. Well, I liked that, but I didn't like this. And just like having these things kind of come out as we're walking from, location A to location B. I think it's more just like sitting down and turning it more into an event of like, all right, what did you think? Like, I remember we did something very similar for the first Michael Bay Transformers movie. We were both huge Transformers fans growing up, and we were, excited, but also a little nervous going into that viewing. And I think we even went out to lunch before the movie and kind of talked about what we wanted to see and what we didn't want to see. Then we saw the movie and then reconvened at the same exact location over drinks. And we were like, oh, did you see that part where Optimus Prime was peeing on someone or Bumblebee or whoever it was? But the point is, it's more just about like getting everything out in more of a conversational form rather than just like spitting out ideas, randomly.
Staying focused. I mean, it's the kind of thing where like, if we'd been doing this back then, we would have made sure to have microphones handy because we would have wanted a very focused discussion about what we were watching. So, I mean, it was your idea. I can confirm that. But I'm all for it, and it makes total sense, and I like that we've continued it.
It's funny that you should mention that because I've been thinking about, like the future of the podcast and, thinking optimistically about, a potential new Friday the 13th movie coming out at some point in the, hopefully near future. But doing just what you said, which is, I think we should record those conversations. Like, hey, here's a podcast episode where Greg and Brian get together and talk about what we think we're going to see or what we want to see in this new Friday the 13th movie. And then there's an episode that happens after the movie where we discuss what we liked and didn't like. Because I think there's some good stuff that comes out of those conversations. And it's definitely something that's in the back of my head that hopefully someday soon we'll be able to execute that. Yeah,
totally. I mean, they'll be good kind of mini-sodes almost where we do the pre-show one, before we get into the 13-minute breakdown that we will inevitably do once it hits home video. But I would suggest that we have our mic setups ready to roll so that the minute we walk back into the hotel room, we can just sit down and start talking, because otherwise it'll be frustrating to have to wait for the 15 or 20 minutes it takes to set everything up.
Speaking of the next time, I can't believe I'm going to say this, and I'll try not to get emotional saying it, but we've only got one more season left.
For now.
But in terms of like movies that have been released and can be discussed, we have one more left. So you'll have that to look forward to later this summer. But in the meantime, rate, review, subscribe, do all that stuff for our podcast. I'm not exactly sure what it does to benefit us, but it can't hurt if you like.
Well, yeah, I mean, the more the word spreads, the more people listen. It helps us out. So we're very grateful for you listening and the feedback that we get. But we're always happy to have more too. So anything you can do to help spread the word is greatly appreciated.
So if you'd like to find out what happens in the final chapter of the final podcast, you'll just have to tune in later this year. But until then, thank you for listening. This has been You're All